It is Friday, September the 13th, and this is Political Palette. Donald Trump and Kamala Harris met in person for the very first time at their ABC political debate this week. I'm here to tell you all about the ups, downs, and who really won the debate this time around. Is the Harris-Walz campaign really based on facts or fiction? That and more in today's show. As promised, we're tackling the most talked about event in the political world right now, the Kamala Harris and Donald Trump debate. I know what you're thinking, I'm a progressive, but come on, even progressive has to admit when something feels off. Now, I'm not here to side with Trump, I mean, let's be real, but even a broken clock is right twice a day. So today we're diving deep into the possibility that this debate was rigged. Could the moderators have been biased? Was Kamala fact-checked less than Trump? And most importantly, why does this matter? Let's get into it. Let's start with what a debate should be. In theory, a debate is where two candidates go head-to-head, presenting their arguments, plans, and policies for the nation. Ideally, the moderators act as neutral referees, right? They ask the tough questions and make sure the candidates are playing by the rules. The moderator's role is crucial. They are supposed to be the gatekeepers of truth. When one candidate makes a false claim, it's their job to challenge it. But what happens when the referees aren't calling the game equally? On paper, the debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump was billed as a historic event, the first head-to-head showdown of this election cycle. The media was hyping it as the ultimate clash of ideologies, a chance for the nation to decide between two very different visions for America. But what happens when the refs don't blow the whistle when they're supposed to? This is where things get interesting. Let's talk about the moderators, shall we? Typically, they're journalists or political analysts, supposedly chosen for their neutrality. But can we really believe that in this case? From the start, it seemed like there was an uneven playing field. Kamala Harris wasn't hit with as many tough questions, and when she dodged questions, the moderators just let her slide. Meanwhile, Trump, love him or hate him, got grilled. The man couldn't finish a sentence without being interrupted, fact-checked, or asked to clarify. If you were watching just for the spectacle, you might have not noticed, but if you were paying close attention, it became glaringly obvious. It's as if the moderators had two sets of rules. And Kamala's evasions were treated like clever political maneuvering, while Trump's were hammered down as dishonesty. Now, Trump certainly has a track record of stretching the truth, I'll give you that. But we can't ignore that Kamala also made some questionable statements that flew under the radar. Could it be that the moderators were instructed, or at least influenced, to go easy on her? This is something that bothers me personally because I want to see a fair and a true debate. I want to know the candidate fully and transparently. During Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump in 2016, there was a lot of press coverage, interviews, media, and debates, all to show us how both candidates really were. There was no rigging or propping up one candidate over another, none of that. And that's a time that we need to go back to. The fact that in this election, things are really strange and the news media is pretty much siding with the candidate and helping them pretty much win is just dishonesty. But what if I told you they're not helping Kamala win? They're actually damaging the image of Kamala Harris. Voters aren't stupid, and you can't take them as such. I mean, sure, some people are more uneducated than others and might not understand the political world as much as some other people in the world. But I will say this. The American people deserve transparency. Now, here's where things get even more suspicious. Fact-checking is supposed to be an impartial process. When one candidate lies, you call it out. But during the debate, it felt like only one candidate was under the magnifying glass: Donald Trump. Now let's look at the facts, or rather the lack of them when it comes to Kamala. At several points during the debate, she made statements that were, at best, misleading and at worst, flat out incorrect. And yet, the moderators didn't even challenge her. Whether she was glossing over details about her past policies or making vague claims about her future plans, Kamala was rarely asked to back up her statements with concrete facts. Now, I'm not going to sit here and just claim that things were biased without giving you any examples. This is not how I operate the show. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. So, let's go through some specific moments from the debate that should raise some eyebrows. Kamala was asked about fracking. She said she always supports fracking, a mix of it, if you will. But I'm sure you, as many other Americans, have noticed she was against fracking, just as Joe Biden was during their electoral run in 2020. They made a huge deal about fracking and stood firm on the idea of completely banning it. But now, all of a sudden, Kamala says she never wanted to do that. She never wanted to ban fracking. That is just straight up untrue. Now, Kamala's claim that the economy was booming before the pandemic hit and that Trump's policies were responsible for its collapse? Hold up. The reality is a bit more complex than that. Yes, the economy took a nosedive, but that had a lot more to do with the global pandemic than any specific policy. And yet when Kamala made this sweeping claim, the moderators didn't bat an eye. Now, let's contrast that with how Trump was treated. He made some pretty outlandish claims about voter fraud. Classic Trump, right? But the moderators were all over him like bees on honey. They immediately jumped in, fact-checked him live, and asked for specific evidence. Sure, he's made similar claims before, but why was Kamala allowed to make bold, sweeping statements without the same level of scrutiny? And during the debate with Trump, Kamala claimed that no U.S. forces were in active combat zones. However, U.S. Central Command said that U.S. forces were in operation in western Iraq on August 29th. 7 U.S. soldiers were injured, as more than 200 troops from both the U.S. and Iraq, including elite Army Rangers backing up the main assault force, hunted down fighters in bunkers over miles of remote terrain. The operation led to the deaths of 14 insurgents, including Abu Ali al-Tunisi, one of the most significant bomb makers for ISIS. The announcement of the operation was made on August 30th, long before the debate took place, and it would have been easy for ABC to fact-check. We have to ask ourselves, is this part of a larger plan? Debates are, well, after all, a spectacle. They're designed to shape public perception, and it's possible that the moderators were more concerned with creating a narrative than actually holding both candidates accountable. It's no secret that Kamala Harris is seen as the Democratic Party's best shot at retaining the White House. It's also no secret that the media tends to lean more left than right. Could it be that the moderators were intentionally soft on her to make her look more competent and presidential? After all, these debates aren't just about what's said in the moment. They're about shaping the story that gets told afterward. This brings us to the bigger question. Was this debate rigged? Not in the obvious shady backroom way, but in the way the questions were framed, the tone of the moderators, and the lack of the pushback on Kamala. I'm not saying there's a grand conspiracy here, but it's worth thinking about. Now, you might just ask yourself, why does this even matter? It's just one debate. Well, it matters because debates are one of the few times we get to see the candidates on an even playing field. Or at least we're supposed to. If the moderators are biased, or if one candidate is treated more favorably than the other, It distorts the democratic process. People deserve to see the candidates held to the same standards. Think about it. If Kamala is being shielded from tough questions and fact-checking now, what happens when she's president? Will she be held accountable for her decisions, or will she continue to get a free pass from the media? And on the flip side, if Trump's every word is scrutinized to the point of absurdity, how can we trust that we're getting a fair assessment of his policies? Debates like this are supposed to be moments of clarity for voters, but if the game is rigged, how could we trust the outcome? At the end of the day, whether or not this debate was outright rigged depends on how you define the term. If you're talking about deliberate, backroom deals to favor one candidate over the other, we don't have evidence of that. But if you're talking about subtle biases from the moderators, the way the questions were framed, and the lack of equal fact-checking, then yeah, I think it's fair to say that this debate was slanted in Kamala's favor. It doesn't take a conspiracy theorist to see that something was off. Maybe it was unintentional. Maybe the moderators are just products of a media ecosystem that tends to favor the left. Or maybe, just maybe, there was a concerted effort to make Kamala look good and Trump look bad. So where does that leave us? As voters, we need to stay skeptical. Whether you support Kamala or Trump, or neither, it's important to recognize when the system is being manipulated, even if it's subtle. And debates are supposed to give us a clear picture of the candidates and their policies. When that picture gets distorted, democracy itself is at risk. Now, as we are always fair on this show, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the falsehoods that Trump made during this week's debate. Let's get right into it. So, of course, Trump boasted that inflation was practically non-existent during his presidency. That's just not true. It was around 7.8% year over year. Sure, it wasn't a crisis, but it certainly wasn't the utopia he's describing. And then, of course, he tried to dump all the blame on Biden, saying that under Biden, inflation was the worst in history. Let's pause on that for a moment. Worse in history? That's false again. Inflation peaked at 9.1% in June of 22. But we've had worse inflation in U.S. history, like back in the 1980s when it hit over 13%. So what is Trump's claim? Not even close to the worst. If anything, is selective memory at best, and outright gaslighting at worst. Now on to one of Trump's classic hits, immigration. He loves to paint this picture of lawless criminals streaming all over the border, and this time he cranked it up a notch. He claimed that millions of criminals from prisons and mental institutions are pouring into the U.S. Millions. Seriously? This is pure fiction. And there's absolutely zero evidence for that. In fact, fact checkers across the board have repeatedly debunked these kinds of exaggerated claims. And wait for it. He also dug up an old wild conspiracy about Haitian immigrants in Ohio eating pets. Yes, that's a real thing he said on stage, and it was debunked ages ago and earned a pants on fire rating from PolitiFact. Trump keeps pulling out these ridiculous, racist narratives like they're facts, and they're just not. And then the next one, of course, abortion. In one of the most outrageous moments of the night, Trump falsely accused Democrats of supporting the execution of babies after birth. Yeah, you heard me right. He literally said that Democrats want to kill babies after birth. But here's the truth. It is not legal anywhere in the U.S. to kill a baby after birth. In fact, moderators had to jump in during the debate to call him out on that in real time. And this claim is not just a lie, it's dangerous and inflammatory. But that's the Trump playbook. Scare tactics and misinformation. And finally, we can't go through a Trump debate without him pushing his false 2020 election narrative. He claimed that no judge ever looked at his election lawsuits. That's another flat out lie. The reality is, at least 10 of his cases were reviewed and decided on the merits. They weren't dismissed for technical reasons or whatever excuse he's making now, but they were flat out rejected because they had no standing. So let's put that to bed once and for all. His lawsuits were heard, they just didn't go his way. In other news, the CHNV program launched by the Biden administration represents a significant shift in U.S. immigration policy, aiming to manage the ongoing migration crisis at the southern border in a structured and humane manner. Announced in early 2023 and expanded after an initial successful trial with Venezuelan migrants in 2022, this initiative permits up to 30,000 migrants from the 4 countries to apply for humanitarian parole each month, provided they have a U.S.-based sponsor. That could be the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, American Immigration Council, etc. And the 4 nations, Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, share a common theme of political instability, authoritarian governance, economic crisis, and widespread violence. These circumstances have driven mass migration as citizens from these countries flee in search of safety and stability. The CHNV program was designed to provide an orderly legal alternative to irregular migration, which had been straining U.S. border resources. By offering an option to legally enter the U.S., the program seeks to reduce unlawful border crossings and lessen the humanitarian crises at the border. How the CHNV program works. Under the CHNV program, migrants must have a U.S.-based sponsor. The sponsor must be a U.S. citizen, permanent resident, or an individual with legal immigration status. Sponsors are required to fill out a form demonstrating their financial support for the applicant. This step helps ensure that migrants who are arriving in the U.S. do not become an economic burden on public resources. Sponsors are vetted through a background check, which includes criminal and financial records scrutiny. Approved migrants are then eligible for work authorization, allowing them to seek employment in the U.S. during their parole. They can access benefits such as Medicaid and food stamps, further helping them to integrate and build stable lives while awaiting the possibility of permanent statuses. Impact and cost. Since its launch, the CHNV program has facilitated the entry of over 520,000 migrants into the U.S., and it continues to grow. As of mid-2023, the program had helped nearly 160,000 people from 4 countries to enter the U.S. legally. This influx of migrants comes with a significant price tag, costing the U.S. an estimated $3.4 billion in terms of benefits, administrative costs, and resource allocation. Critics argue that while this cost is high, it is a necessary investment in managing the humanitarian crisis and providing safe pathways to migration. For each migrant, the costs associated with Medicaid, food stamps, and other benefits are substantial, but proponents of the program argue that these costs are offset by the reduction in resources needed to handle irregular migration at the border. Furthermore, many of these migrants contribute to the workforce, helping fill gaps in sectors such as agriculture, construction, and healthcare. And as I've said before on the show, those categories of jobs are ones that lazy Americans just refuse to do on a daily basis. That's why immigration is a good thing, really, if you look at the grand scheme of things and you see how this is actually helping our economy in some ways. Of course, some people will argue the money spent by the U.S. for this program is undoubtedly unnecessary. But I will say, I think it's a better use of resources than spending more on policing. And now, It's time for everyone's favorite segment, Matty's Point of View. Let's get right into it. So, my thoughts on the recent presidential debate is the following. I feel like we see two candidates who both are weak and, in my opinion, don't deserve to even be in the presidential running. But this is what we got, and we have to take what we can get. Like some people are saying on the front lines right now, we take the lesser of two evils. And to think that evil even deserves a place in the highest office of our land is miserable. And a miserable thought, if that. If one of our enemies, such as North Korea, were to launch bombs at California's coast, we need a leader who can act swiftly to consider all the options of retaliation and protecting our land. We need a leader who's not going to be standing in front of a teleprompter reading every single line that comes before them. In a situation like that, you need a tremendous skill in diplomatic strategy. And that's what we need in the White House. And I'm at the point where I see both options as weak ones. I don't agree with Donald Trump. I think his mouth gets him into a lot of trouble. But I will say this, during his presidency, there was no overseas wars or conflicts going on, and inflation was at a much lower point than it currently is. Now, I believe inflation, if you want to get to the topic of inflation, there's multiple types, and it's not only just your financial type where you have the interest rates and all that. It's also shrinkflation, where a company decides, hey, let's make the bag of chips smaller and then raise our profit margins. Or it might be a situation like greedflation, where the company just simply wants to up the price on essential goods such as toilet paper. I went to Weiss the other day with my boyfriend and spent $60 on 4 items. Absolutely ridiculous. And to think that prices are rising this high, I think the government really needs to step in. One thing I like about Kamala's agenda is that she wants to put price gouging laws on companies that are actually taking advantage of the American public. Some people see this as communism, controlling prices, etc. But I see it as a way of stopping these greedy companies from continuing to profit off of the middle class and poor families. I really feel bad for people who have to deal with this on a daily basis. And I often wonder how people even are able to afford the goods that they have, especially with wages not really increasing with the pace of inflation. It's a worrying prospect, and one that I think we need to work on in this country. Whatever happens in November, though, I will say this. The American people will pick the leader that they want to represent them and in the world. This election is the biggest election in our country's history. And as we approach the 250-year anniversary of America, I believe that we will make the best decision for our future and our kids. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to Political Palette. I really appreciate it. You can follow me over at Matty Unhinged on all social media platforms and Matty.unhinged on Instagram. Go to MattyUnhinged.com to see all of my sites and companies. Thank you and have an incredible week.